class at Beth Torah, this actually is the one that all the guys go to because it really is all about the, sort of those, it brings up all the old West images. So I try to use all of the country Western metaphors to make it work, but nonetheless, it's all good.
It's all
Well, it looks like with it being the start of 2 o'clock, we can at least somewhat get started. What do y'all think? Dina, Rochelle, are we ready to rock and roll? Rochelle, you're muted.
Rochelle's muted.
Sorry.
Let's do
I'm
it.
gonna, yeah, we're recording, so you can go ahead and I'm gonna try to check in with the people who aren't here yet.
Great. All right. Well, as I said a second ago, I managed to have an 8-month-old puppy. So if you hear any barking or crazy sounds coming from the Schweitzer land, don't be surprised. But my name is Barry Kaplan Schweitzer, and I'm the Director of Congregational Learning for the one and only Congregation Beth Torah. And it gives me great joy to share with you this class that I developed for our adult education series. The concept is, so often we think, or at least there's sort of this stereotypical image of Jews coming through Ellis Island, working in sweatshops, being those Central Eastern European immigrants who then settle in New York or other East Coast cities. And the truth is that some of the more adventurous definitely followed a completely different path and joined other hardy Americans and non-Jewish immigrants. This is not exactly just a Jewish immigrant story, but we're going to focus on those fascinating individuals who made it west to seek their fortune in the land of opportunity, from the Mississippi Valley all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And because, of course, we are in Texas, we're going to spend 2 weeks looking at Jews in the early Jews in Texas, as well as those that really built and shaped Dallas and North Texas. So, of course, I could do a whole 6-week series on just Dallas Jewish history, but you'll find that we're going to be looking at, with the work of several articles and different multimedia, we're going to be studying through their words these just gregarious and interesting personalities. And so the case for so many of them were the settlers on the open frontier. And it's worth noting what you and I might see through our 2021 lenses of what is modern Jewish religion is very different during these time periods from, and for that matter, living in Texas is very different today than it was especially in the 17 and 1800s that we'll be looking at. So just to kind of give us an outline of what we're going to be covering, this week again and next week, as I said, we're going to be looking at the early Jews in Texas, the Jews in Dallas and North Texas, and then we're moving west. We're going to be north and west. We're going to be focusing on March 9th on beyond the wide Missouri, how there were actually lands that were designated potentially as a new Zion, an opportunity for Jewish communities to build farming communities in parts of the Midwest. On March 16th, we're going to be looking at riveted jeans, shopkeepers, and ranchers in railroad towns. I should mention I am a native of Nevada. I should also point that out. Bonus points if you say it correctly. We get very, very angry if you say it as Nevada. So if you learn one thing from this class about Jews going west, let it be that we say the state Nevada, not Nevada. But nonetheless, I want to share with you the history of Levi's jeans, Jews from my home state, along with Arizona and Utah, and how as the trains continued to move their way western, that also meant that Jews followed and developed shopkeepers, etc. And then on March 23rd, we'll close with Silver, Gold, and Jewish Cowboys, talking about how some of our Jewish ancestors, patriarchs, if you will, actually developed towns, like being one of the first mayors of San Francisco. So now that we sort of have a goal of what we're going to be accomplishing, I'd like today to think about some of these points to ponder. I want us to think about what were some of the ways in which Jews took part in the migration to the great American West. How would you feel about being one of the only Jews in a small frontier town? And what kind of sacrifices or persona would it have taken to take that challenge on? How large was the Jewish community that you grew up in? And what are the advantages and disadvantages of a large or small Jewish community? So those are my questions that I'm planting the seed in your brain before I start this historical dialogue. When you logged in for the class or when you signed up for the class, were there things that you were really, burning in your kishka that you wanted to know that maybe I can help to answer? I'm going to open that up. Is there anything that you had in mind that you'd really like to touch base upon? Patty sort of gave me a head shake no. So far, so well, let me ask this way. Does that sound good? Are we good for what I have entailed? Are we good for that?
All right. Yes, let's go.
All right, so as you said, let's go. It's like, oh wait, I took a sip and then I couldn't swallow it. All right, let's get rolling. So here we go. I love that enthusiasm. Well, part of where this journey for me, starting with where they went and how they got there, as Carol will attest, I am a genealogy nerd. And for me, having my family, the Kaplan side, be completely all that sort of Eastern European myth, I was fascinated by this photo that I found in a frame that had belonged to my husband's grandmother. Well, lo and behold, the gentleman is actually named Meyer Lichtenstein, and he is my husband. See that handsome bald head behind me? That is actually his fourth great grandfather. Now, Joel didn't know that at the time. This was just a photo that I've actually been able to go back and place who this person was. But what is so interesting to me is that Jews have always been a part of the warp and weft of the Lone Star State and of the surrounding areas of the Southwest since the period of Spanish Texas. To the untamed future state came Jewish seekers of fortune and freedom. Heirs to the Spanish and European forms of Jewish ritual practice, the Jews of Texas adapted their seminal faith to the new ambiance without damaging the integrity of the multi-millennial tradition. Though some abandoned their roots, and we will definitely be looking at that as we explore some of these personalities this afternoon, most were tenacious in the nurturing of their heritage. Before 1821, and this is an important fact to ponder, Jews who openly practiced their religion could not live in Texas because as a Spanish colony, only Catholics could take up residence. So often those Jews found themselves in, either in sort of the conversos role. Now, of course, some of the Jewish immigrants from Europe arrived in the port of New Orleans, as did Joel's ancestor here, Meyer Lichtenstein, and stayed. They made New Orleans a center of Jewish life in the South. So for me, that's what I was so fascinated by, was understanding what brought them there. Why did they choose this path? And what we found with Meyer was that he actually arrived in the mid 1700s, found that ability, like so many of these other people, that was Judaism the way it was in Eastern Europe? No. And it gave him the chance to really create a foundation in a place that he had never expected. Now, others continued up the Mississippi River, and they made their homes in the cotton market towns of Memphis, Tennessee, or in the mill towns like Natchez and Vicksburg, Mississippi, and Shreveport, Louisiana. Some found work in Baton Rouge, which was a cotton shipping town. At least a few Jewish families settled in almost every important Southern town. And if you're ever interested in digging a little bit deeper, a lot of the research material that I pulled this class from actually comes from the Institute for Southern Jewish Life, which many of our congregations have used and partnered with in the Metroplex. And in fact, we actually use it for our curriculum at Beth Torah. And I think, other congregations do as well. So, most of these early Texas Jews had a tenuous connection to the Jewish religion and made little effort to establish Jewish institutions or religious practices in the state. Again, part of that had to do with, as they developed, the fact that Texas wasn't allowing them originally, so they kind of went undercover. Others were Jews that, that frontier spirit is something that we're going to refer back to. They were trying to find a way to make a foundation for themselves and their family. And so they were often Jewish by culture or Jewish by importance, as part of their fabric, but that didn't necessarily mean that they were as observant as maybe some of their other cousins in other communities. Now, organized Jewish life in Texas didn't begin until 1854, when a group of Jews in Houston bought land for a cemetery and later started a Hebrew Benevolent Association. In 1859, 32 men established Beth Israel, the state's first Jewish congregation. Now, in the decades after the Civil War, congregations were founded in Galveston in 1868, Jefferson in 1873, Dallas in 1874, San Antonio, Austin, 1876, Waco in 1879, Hempstead in 1880, Gainesville, then Texarkana, Brenham, Tyler, Marshall, Fort Worth in 1892, Victoria, Beaumont, El Paso, Corsicana had a very large congregation. I just out of curiosity, how many of you have seen the Jewish community in Corsicana? I thought maybe at some point you've taken a tour. Well, I know that in other classes, Jen emails me of ideas for future JCC road trips. That can be one of them that we can maybe plan along the lines. And Greenville in 1899. So even prior to the start of the 20th century, there was a good amount of Jewish communities here in the state of Texas. Now, a small number of Jewish merchants settled in Texas in the 1820s and the 1830s, and also in New Mexico around that same time frame, when those two future states were still part of the country of Mexico. And one of those settlers was Adolphus Stern, who is here in this picture. And he smuggled arms to Sam Houston and then fought for the independence of Texas for Mexican rule. So here we are from the very beginning of the state of Texas. Jews were at the start. So to tell you a little bit about Stern, he immigrated to the United States from Germany in 1817, living in Louisiana first for about a decade. And in 1826, he moved to Nacogdoches, Texas, where he operated a mercantile, and he again smuggled weapons for the colonists who wished to rebel against Mexico. His position as a Freemason really helped save him from a death sentence, and Stern went on to finance the two companies of men known as the New Orleans Greys to assist in fighting in the Texas Rebellion. It's funny. Now, as a girl from Nevada, am I repeating a lot of the things? Did y'all learn this in Texas history? Okay, so I have to say, like, my kids are like, Mom, that's old news. It's so funny how, our kids tend to have this, such there's a lot in our Texas history classes. Okay, great. I just also scanned the group and I'm glad to see Sandy and David with us. Fantastic. Welcome, welcome. All right. So, going back to Stern and how he was helpful with his New Orleans Greys. Stern then moves to Nacogdoches, and his mercantile business takes off. At that time, he was required to swear an oath of loyalty to Mexico, which of course governed Texas at the time. And despite having given his oath, Stern soon became involved in the Fredonian Rebellion, smuggling arms in coffee barrels. So he really lived life on the edge. He was arrested and sentenced to death for treason after spies in New Orleans had reported his activities. His guards were also Freemasons and allowed him to take a great deal of freedom, finally releasing him on the grounds that he swore an oath that he would never take arms against the government. So he eventually marries in 1828 Eva Catherine Rosine Ruff, an immigrant from Württemberg, Germany, who had also lived in Louisiana. The couple lived in Nacogdoches, where they raised their 7 children. Now, a really kind of interesting thing about Stern, Sam Houston actually lived with them for a time. So if you can imagine Sam Houston couch surfing, he ends up, living with the Sterns. And when he did, Sam Houston was actually baptized as a Roman Catholic in the Stearns parlor. So how this works, whether Stern was not as observant as his wife, if he was willing to give up Judaism in this time, it's really hard to say. But Eva Stern served as Sam Houston's children's godmother, or as she kind of was herself declared the role of helping Sam Houston to practice his religion. Stern was asked to be the godfather for Sam Houston, but he refused. Want to hear why? This is kind of funny. Because the date that Sam Houston had chosen to practice, or had been baptized into Catholicism, was Yom Kippur. So therefore, Stern felt that was the line. He couldn't do it because he couldn't serve as godfather because it was on Yom Kippur. So with the assistance of the requirements of Mexican law, Eva succeeded in converting Stern officially to the Catholic faith, although unofficially he remained a deist. Stern also worked as an interpreter in English, French, Spanish, German, Yiddish, Portuguese, and Latin. Now, after Texas was annexed to the United States, Stern was elected to the Texas House of Representatives, where he served 3 terms. In 1851, he was elected to the Texas State Senate, and he died in New Orleans in 1852. So there's going to be some things that we're going to see a lot during these early personalities in Texas. Again, it's that frontier religiosity. Maybe they had a connection to Judaism. Obviously, there were things about Stern that while his wife was a practicing Catholic, he was more of a deist. There's going to be some of that, and especially also that there weren't synagogues and an accessibility to religion in the same way. So again, when I tell you to think of life in a different, we have to take off our 2020 lenses, 2021 lenses, that's part of what I mean. Now, I want to introduce, of course, knowing that we have learned a little bit about Sam Houston, I want us to kind of meet another gentleman, David Kokernot, who plays a role in the Jewish community as well. So soon after winning independence from Spain in 1821, Mexico began encouraging colonization in Texas. During the next 15 years, over 20,000 settlers poured into our state. Among them were a handful of Jews, including the gentleman on the top left, David Kokernot. He was born in Amsterdam in 1805, and Kokernot came to New Orleans with his father in 1817, so only at 12 years old, and in the same year was apprenticed to a pilot on the Mississippi River. So he learns how to be a paddle boat pilot. After a career as a merchant seaman took him to Europe and the West Indies, Kokernot invested a few $1,000s in merchandise, and in 1832 traveled by schooner with his wife and children from New Orleans to the town of Ananak off of Galveston Bay, where he opened a store in the vicinity of a large Mexican garrison. 2 years later, on a trip to the pueblo of Nacogdoches, Kokernot met Sam Houston. Now, normally is when I would pass out some handouts and share with you some of the articles of how they met each other. Instead, in this visual platform, we get to see it via the text. Do I have anyone who would like to maybe share and give my voice a break and feel like reading this article for me?
I will.
Thank you, Joe.
Sam Houston was dressed in a complete Indian costume made of buckskin and ornamented with a profuse variety of beads, and his massive head was covered with a fine broad beaver hat. When he arose, I stopped and looked at him with both surprise and admiration and bid him good morning. Now, my friend, said the general, tell me the news. I replied the news was war, that it was rumored that Santa Anna was gathering troops to send into Texas to disarm the inhabitants. But, said I, we are determined not to surrender our arms. Well, my friend, said he, how will you act in that case? I replied, we will fight them to the last or die in the attempt. Let me keep going.
Sure. Does anyone else want to take the column on the right? Thank you, Joe.
I'll keep going if nobody.
Oh, that would be great.
That is right, said he. They shall never drive us out so long as we can fight them. As he made this remark, his eyes sparkled with lightning. A bottle of wine was ordered on the strength of it. Now, said he, the people ought to organize and get ready to meet him. I told him I was of the same opinion. Who will command the army? He asked. I replied, my dear sir, if I have the authority to make the appointment, you are the man, for you are the finest looking man I ever laid eyes on. He immediately replied, well, my dear sir, if I get the appointment of commander, I will give you a commission. Then he pulled out a small pocketbook and asked my name, which he wrote in his book, and then wrote his own name and handed it to me. After talking a while longer, we shook hands and bade each other farewell. From that day, I loved Sam Houston. He proved a friend indeed in times of need, as many letters in my possession will show.
Excellent. Thank you. So whenever I think of Sam Houston, I think of that big statue on the way to Houston, and not exactly the, the costume made of buckskin and ornamented, with a profuse of beads. No worries. So if you can't read, don't worry about it. It's all good. And I have my text, so we can make that work. Did anything surprise you or shock you about the way these men did business, or how we managed to get someone to help lead Sam Houston's army? Not so much. All right. I'm just scanning the crowd. Excellent. All righty. So what kind of guy does Sam Houston, of course, Sam Houston, not Jewish, but he befriended, and I think compared to how when Texas was under Mexican rule, Sam Houston definitely was this very friendly, warm character, and made it a point to be able to befriend those folks who, at least from the David Kokernot or the Kokernot story, and from Stern, we know that he was warm and affable. So our next Jewish settler that we'd like to introduce you to is to Moses Albert Levy. And he was another early Texas Jewish settler. He served as a surgeon in Sam Houston's army, and in December 1835, he took an active part in storming the Alamo, which resulted in the Texas forces capturing the fort from the Mexicans. That you already, I know you know that part of the history, but you might not know the Jewish part of the Alamo. So Albert Moses Levy was born to Abraham and Rachel Bernard Levy in 1800, probably in the Netherlands. We're not exactly sure, but we do know that the family moved to Richmond, Virginia in 1818. Albert, who was Jewish, married Maria Bishop, an Episcopalian, around 1830. You'll see a theme here. These men were willing to make this frontier lifestyle. That didn't mean that there was also sometimes the Jewish spouse that could accompany that. But I'm not making a judgment call. I'm just pointing that out. So they had one child that was born in 1832. And then after Levy completed medical school at the University of Pennsylvania in 1834, they continued moving west. Eventually, they moved to New Orleans, where Levy's older brother had lived. And it was there in New Orleans that Albert Levy joined the New Orleans Greys. So there's another link going back to Adolphus Stern, who was also one of the Greys. And within 2 months, he was appointed surgeon in chief of the Volunteer Army of Texas. His army career lasted from October of 1835 to February of 1836, and included service in the siege of Bexar, where he was wounded. After leaving the army, he actually joined the Texas Navy and served briefly on the Brutus. David Burnett, who was president of the Republic of Texas, signed Levy's papers appointing him as surgeon in the Navy in March of 1836. On April 17th of 1837, Levy's ship, the Independence, was captured by 2 Mexican brigs of war. I know that's one of those things I have to point out. Even though I said he had a short army service, what an amazing man that he not only served in the army, but then went on to serve in the Navy because of his medical background. That's why they needed him to serve in the next branch. So here's the big part. In 1837, Levy was serving on the ship the Independence, and it was captured by 2 Mexican brigs of war. After 3 months of being imprisoned, he actually escapes. And not only does he escape, he manages to walk all the way back to Texas. I'm a marathoner. I run 26 miles for fun. I can't imagine walking back from across Mexico into Texas. And that's where he set up his medical practice in Matagorda. The next year, he received an appointment to a medical board established by both houses of the Congress of the Republic. On April 4th of 1838, he remarried, also an Episcopalian, and they had 5 children. Unfortunately, he committed suicide in May of 1848. The state of Texas honored him with a historical marker in Matagorda, and the city of Houston declared April 30th, just if you're keeping score, April 30th of 1986 was officially Albert Moses Levy Memorial Day in honor of all the Jews who participated in the fight for Texas independence. In the following letter to his sister back east, Levy describes what was possibly the most exciting experience of his life. So, I know it's another letter. I'll give you all a break and I'll read this one. So he says, oh, sorry, did somebody want to do it? I got you covered. Okay, so he says, this is at San Antonio. This is his 1835, when he's at the Alamo. Dearest sister, the Americans, with a view to besieging the town and fort, which is the largest and strongest in all of Texas, assembled themselves before its walls by slow degrees, but never at any one time amounting to more than 700 men. When we reached the American camp, after suffering 1,000 deaths and traveling through and sleeping in the cold, bleak prairies night after night, without a tree or shrub to shelter us from the cold, rain, and wind, we found the greatest state of confusion and dissatisfaction. The men had left their families and homes with a view to driving the enemy out of their country at once and then returning home. But instead of this, their miserable general thought proper to starve out the enemy and prevented the Americans from immediately storming the place. The length of time this took tired out the patience of the soldiers, who were all volunteers, and some almost naked. Finally, affairs became so bad that the army broke up in confusion, and desperate would have been the consequences, for we would all have been cut by the enemy when I, insignificant I, and another individual, beat up for volunteers who would join us to and storming the town and fort that very night. Our company, called the Grays, immediately and to a man signed their names, and mounting one of the baggage wagons, for we, as I have observed, we're just ready for a hasty retreat. I harangued them for a few minutes and thus succeeded in getting 300 men. We laid our plans, appointed our leaders, and about daylight marched up to the enemy's halls, got into some strong houses in town, and after a regular storm of 5 days, let's make sure I'm on the right slide. There we go. Sorry about that. Appointed, let's see, and now we laid our plans, appointed our leaders, and about daylight marched up to the enemy's halls, got some strong houses in town, and after a regular storm of 5 days and nights duration, during the whole of which the enemy kept up in incessant firing, we forced them to surrender, thus achieving a victory perfectly unparalleled in history. A victory obtained in 225 disorganized and undisciplined men, armed with muskets and bayonets, in a well-fortified fort with 30 pieces of cannon of different sizes. Our men fight like devils, even I thought. I worked in the ditches. I dressed the sick and wounded. I cheered the men. I assisted the officers in their councils. For 5 days and nights, I did not sleep that many hours, running about without a coat or hat, dirty and ragged, but thank God, escaped and are uninjured. I have crossed the street when more than 200 muskets were shot at me, our men begging me not to expose myself, as I was a double man, being both a soldier and a surgeon. Woofda, huh? What are your thoughts about Moses Albert Levy, or Albert Moses Levy? Hopefully I didn't put you to sleep, right?
No.
Did you know that there was such ambitious or courageous Jews in Texas?
He's quite a hero.
Quite a hero, yeah. Brave, courageous, thanks. Yeah, it's so interesting. So often, these are some of the stories that we don't necessarily hear in our history, and especially this gentleman, with his history, it's really impressive that he was honored with a special day. Janice, I see your hand up.
Well, it's just so interesting that the perception of Jews in the rest of the world, especially in Europe, is they were like sheep being led to the slaughter. There was nothing, they were in ghettos, they weren't free. And here's this wild man in Texas, just free as a bird to be dirty and to be a leader, and just like he probably was living the life as compared to the rest of the Jews at that time in the world, like pogroms and in ghettos and the worst.
Right. And it's interesting, his upbringing, right? Knowing that he was from what we guess was the Netherlands, or the fact, he might have had, we're not sure if he had Sephardic ancestry. We think he did. So there might be some different foundations that were built for him that gave him some of the courage or the capacity to take that kind of courage that maybe those who were living in the Pale of Settlement at the time, without having that emancipation or without having that ability to participate in education. But yeah, I mean, he breaks that total nebbishy stereotype of, the nerdy guy calculating numbers in the background. Like he's a lot different than what we imagine if we had to paint a stereotypical picture. And to think that he was part of Texas's history is really interesting. I also think it's interesting, again, non-judgmental, looking at his life as a whole, knowing that he took his own life. I can't help but wonder, was some of the trauma that he witnessed in battle, did that lead him to his eventual demise? I mean, to think of him just, seeing all of that war and gore in the battlefield, did that have an impact on him? It's hard to know.
Are there any surviving letters that are closer to the time of his death that relate to
That's a great question, and I don't think so. But that's definitely something to look after and to learn more about, because he was quite a character. The articles that I found, there's an awesome book called Pioneer Jews and the Westward Movement of America. So that article, that letter was taken from that book. But because he's such a Texas legend, there might be more things in his paper at UT Austin, or it's worth checking out. You might send me down that rabbit hole to figure that out. But yeah. Any other thoughts?
The other thing is, the people who were attracted to the frontiers were of a different stripe than the ones who would stay in the other settlements in the United States. He didn't stay in New Orleans where there were other Jews. He went to where the action was. So this was part of his persona to begin with.
You're so right. And I admit that I think that's part of why sometimes I'm pointing out that, maybe they didn't marry Jewishly, that they were willing, they needed an opportunity, and they were those go-getters who, there are those of us who are very committed to being in a community. I mean, we're, after all, told in Pirkei Avot the importance of staying part of a community. Sometimes these were people who lived on the edge and really went that extra direction, sometimes because they wanted to build a Jewish freedom in this going west, and others were because they were lone wolves and that they were out on their own. And we'll definitely see some of that as we continue to go forward.
The other point is that really there's not a lot of anti-Semitism when you get away from the Spanish influence, that even today, if you go into areas of West Texas, they don't even know that Rosen is a Jewish name in some communities. I mean, each person was viewed on their own merits in these smaller communities.
That's true. And I'm gonna, that's a yes. And I feel like Carol gets my gold star for today. I will admit that I'm going to agree with you. And then later in today's session, I'm going to point out how there definitely were some anti-Semites. Judge Roy Bean. We'll get to him in a minute. So, all righty, here we go. So now that we've learned a little bit about Levi, let's take a look at another one of our early, Jewish settlers, Henry Castro. Maybe not the most handsome of folks, not being judgmental. I had really wanted to find maybe a better picture, but it was the 1860s, so photos weren't always so pretty, let's be honest. But Henry's story is really interesting. He was born a very wealthy French Jew he was allowed to actually start a colony called Castroville, which was southwest Texas, kind of to Carol's point. Castroville is 20 miles west of what is now San Antonio. His family descended from Portuguese Jews who had fled to France after the inception of the Spanish Inquisition. He occupied a position of wealth and status in southwestern France. And at age 19, Castro was appointed by the governor Landis to a committee to welcome Napoleon during a visit to the province. And in 1806, he served as a member of Napoleon's Guard of Honor when the emperor installed his brother Joseph as king of Spain. So that's in itself, knowing the history of both the Spanish and Portuguese Jews, and knowing that this gentleman was able to have that spot in France is pretty impressive. Now, when the Republic of Texas was established in 1836, every man who was the head of a family was granted 1,200 acres of land, and single men received 640 acres. Well, 5 years later, a law was passed that allowed Sam Houston, president of Texas, again, Sam comes back in the story, to grant larger parcels of land. Well, Henry was allowed to start a colony. Again, this is called Castroville. And with his own money, Castro brought 485 families and 457 single men. So when you really start thinking about how many acres that's adding up to, including some with Jewish names, including from France and Germany. Buildings were started and crops were planted. Now, the sad thing about Castro, he eventually loses his entire fortune. But he continued to live in that town until his death in 1861. And because of his commitment to life in the Panhandle and how he tried so desperately to start and to bring all of these people from France and Germany, the county, Castro County, is actually named in his honor. So if you ever drive through Castro County, you can imagine this handsome gentleman when you do. All right. Now moving along to, of course, I was saying earlier, there are people who were the lone wolves, like Adolphus Stern. And then there are folks who really founded this area with the mindfulness of bringing community to the forefront. Now, the Sanger brothers is really one of those community-minded families. I'm going to start with talking a little bit about the earliest Sanger, Isaac Sanger. We'll talk a little bit about the brothers and know, of course, that we're going to spend some time next week because really, the Dallas Jewish community starts with the Sangers. In the early 1850s, Isaac Sanger, a German Jewish immigrant, traveled from New York to Texas to cash in on the cattle boom. In no time, Isaac was operating a store in our own McKinney, Texas, a tiny settlement 4 weeks by wagon.
Wow.
Let me say it right. Let me say that again. 4 weeks by wagon to Houston. Can you imagine?
No.
I'm gonna go to Galveston for the weekend for a getaway. It's gonna take a nice 5 hours in my car. If we were to fly, it would take an hour. It took Isaac 4 weeks. So to think about that, after a younger brother, Lehman, he eventually takes over the McKinney operation, Isaac then opens another store in Weatherford. Now, to learn a little bit about the family, Isaac was born in 1836 and lived until 1918. And he was really the first of the Sanger brothers, the son of Elias and Barbetta Sanger. He was born in Obenbright on Maine. So it's really on that, Germany-French border at the time in 1836. And he spent those early years working with his family from everything from winemaking and weaving and selling at neighborhood fairs. And at age 13, he apprenticed in a dry goods house. Now, he ends up at a very young age, coming to America at 16. And after a voyage of more than a month, he arrives in New Haven, Connecticut to live and work for his mother's brother, Jacob Heller. A few months later, Lehman joins him, and then brother Philip arrives. Isaac moved to Texas in 1857 by way of New Orleans and Houston. He and someone named Mr. Baum opened Baum and Sanger on the edge of the wilderness, again, McKinney, Texas. In 1857, I can't even imagine what McKinney must have looked like. And I'm sure Isaac Sanger wouldn't even dream of what McKinney looks like now. When they came, again, they encountered, and this goes back to what Carol was saying earlier, they did encounter anti-Semitic prejudice. When the Civil War broke out, the brothers joined the Confederate forces. As for those of us who took the class, Jews in the South, there were so many who felt so connected to the land that it wasn't just about slavery or defending or being anti-slavery for many of these men who supported the Confederates. It was also about their being supported in the land. Not that I'm making excuses for it. It's still awful. At the end of the war, they were almost destitute. And so the Sanger brothers that were here returned back to Texas, and Isaac was elected the district clerk of Parker County. They started a store in Milliken where Morris Lasker is a partner. Remember that name. Lasker's important. Lasker moves on to Galveston, where he later becomes a civic leader. Now, unfortunately, a yellow fever pandemic caused the Sangers to close their Milliken store and move to Bryan, think College Station. In the 1860s, they followed the Houston and Texas Central Railroad, opening stores throughout north central Texas. Aha! They found the railroad, and that really, as you can imagine, is what was the needed push for their business. They branched south to Waco, north to Sherman, west to Fort Worth, and even built a store in the panhandle town of Clarendon. Not the medicine, but the town. Isaac spent most of his time on the road at auction sales in New Orleans and later deserted the Texas frontier in order to man the company's New York office for 50 years. The Sanger brothers were respected throughout Texas by the time the railroad reached Dallas in 1872. They had established their headquarters. By the turn of the century, the Sanger brothers had become the largest dry goods company west of the Mississippi. In addition to their retail stores, the brothers established a wholesale business second in importance only to Marshall Fields in Chicago. And Isaac died in New York in 1918. So to tell you, there's Castro again. Let's go forward. So a little bit about the brothers themselves. They made part of the anti-Semitism that they experienced was, had to do with here they're moving in and bringing their experience of being in, or specifically Isaac's experience of working in the dry goods business. And it was not exactly an easy time. And so they actually, when they were in Weatherford, received written notice to leave the town or, quote, suffer dire punishment. A few days after that, they received a letter or another symbol with skull and crossbones painted on the door of the store. Not one to be intimidated, Isaac gained the support of his fellow pioneers by contributing generously to a number of fledgling churches in the area. So Isaac takes a stand, and this comes up in other ways that the Jewish community, I've also talked about this in Jews in the South, where one way that Jews could find a way to be accepted was to actually support other organizations so that they would not be seen as the other, but to be seen as accepted members of the community. Think of it as, if you will, instead of, as Isabel Wilkerson talks about a caste system, what the Sangers and other members of the Jewish community were trying to do was break break the norm and try to say that, hey, we're part of this community. And after serving in the Confederate Army, which was a whole nother reason the Sangers tried to do so, was to fit in and be accepted. Lehman and Philip kept in Milliken, and the goods that were on the greatest demand of what they sold were shotguns, revolvers, and ready for this? Musical instruments. But again, it's the 1870s. What else are they going to do? It's not like they were selling radios or TVs. But their goods were sold generally for gold and very little currency being in circulation. At the time, the economy of Texas rested largely on barter. It was therefore not unusual for women to come to the Sangers Brothers store with eggs, butter, or whatever else they had to trade, while men would bring in hides, wool, or vegetables. Barter provided the Sangers with a variety of ways as acting as middlemen. To give but one example, they would exchange a gun for wool, brought in by a rancher, and then transport the wool to New Orleans and sell it to a wholesaler for cash, thus making a double sale. Taking advantage of such opportunities, the Sangers accumulated sizable amounts of liquid assets, which in the late 1860s and early 1870s, they used to open a chain of general merchandise stores at strategic points along the Houston and Texas Railroad, with a different family member taking charge of each new venture. As soon as Dallas began showing signs of becoming a major center of commerce and trade, the Sangers started consolidating their operations here. Except for a store in Waco, all other establishments were closed. The Sangers had no reason to regret this move, for as Dallas bloomed, so did the Sanger brothers, until by the end of the century, again, it had been second only to Marshall Field's in Chicago. So again, we'll talk a little bit more about these men individually next week, but I also, I want to introduce you to Rabbi Abraham Blum. Now, he was born in that same area of Alsace, right on that German-French border, when the Providence was under French rule. He received rabbinic training at the rabbinical school at Niederbronn, graduating at the age of 17. He was very, very smart. Rabbi Blum arrived in the United States in 1866, and he served in synagogues in Ohio and then in Galveston, Texas. He spent 14 years in Galveston, where he also received a medical degree from a local college. A rabbi who came to Texas at this time had to be resourceful in order to survive. Remember, we didn't really have rabbis in this country until the 1840s. So Abraham learned soon after assuming his duties as spiritual leader of Galveston's Temple B'nai Israel in 1871. In addition to leading the congregation's Hebrew school, Blum also served as the president of the local school board, while his wife, Hannah Enrique Blum, took on the task of the synagogue school principal. She was in charge of the higher branches of learning in 2 female schools. He was also a member of the Masons, the Odd Fellows, and the B'nai B'rith, and he was also a doctor, having received a degree from the Medical College of Galveston in 1872. A few years later, he delivered the opening prayer before the Texas House of Representatives in Austin, the very first Jewish man to do so. Now, I'd like to share with you another article, this being from the San Francisco Jewish Progress, which has been attributed to Rabbi Blum. knowing that there was this effort to populate this barren town or this barren state of Texas, it was Rabbi Blum who wrote this article in an effort to try to entice other Jews to move to Texas. So, does anyone feel like reading this?
I'll read it, Barry.
All right. Thank you, Sandy.
I suppose a good many people in your city think that Texas is an entirely wild country, for they hear of so many rough things happening along the Mexican border. But let me tell you that here in this island city on the beautiful Gulf of Mexico, everything looks as pleasant as in any other city twice or thrice its size. The Israelites form but a very small proportion of the 40,000 inhabitants, as we number only about 200 families. But among these children of Israel, a spirit of progress and business ardor reigns so largely that were they to leave Galveston would soon become, I can't read that.
Oh, sorry, provincial.
Okay, become provincial. That's the end of, I can't see below there.
No worries. All right, so I'll take it on from there. Thank you. And I have to say, your tenor and accent was so perfect. I even imagined that I was hearing Rabbi Blum himself. So Asher Koach on that. All right, so to continue on his letter, when you pass down Strand Street, you will read signs of such houses as Ellen H. Blum, Block and Company, Max and Kempner, who also owns the largest hotel in the southern states, Bernstein and Company, M. Coppert, banker, J. Dyer, president of Marine Insurance Company, G. Ranger and Company, J. Rosenfield. In fact, the entire dry goods trade is in the hands of the Jews. Really, I think what he's doing, just as a side note, is trying to play Jewish geography with the people in San Francisco. He's trying to drop some names just in case. So we have 3 Jewish lawyers. Even Jews, Levy Brothers and Company, keep the largest livery stable and deal in coffins and shrouds. So much for the mercantile portion. Know that we have B'nai B'rith Lodge of 85 members, a benevolent society, a synagogue built in 1871 with about 87 members, and a fine Sunday school which numbers 120 people. The synagogue has been in charge of Reverend A. Blum. Remember, so often, especially during this time in the, what would become the Reform movement, they would refer to themselves as Reverend, not always as Rabbi. Since its consecration, and the Hebrew and Sunday schools are flourishing under his management. Last Sunday, the closing exercises took place. The children were placed on this occasion in front of the ark and questioned on the whole 24 books of the Bible, then in Jewish history, down to the period of Moses Mendelssohn. So what do you think? Did he sell you? Are you ready to come to Galveston and live there? What are your thoughts? Anything?
In those days, absolutely. I mean, but until the hurricane at the turn of the century, Galveston was the place, what I've always understood.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it really, it's and especially I think he was smart in targeting the people in San Francisco. Ironically, they also suffered sadly, their own disaster, the earthquake that happened not so off of that same time frame. But he's built Galveston to be a community that has everything that a Jewish community would need, right? There's, a synagogue, there's obviously trade and business, a benevolent society. So there's a Hevra Kadisha, there's, a community that you can latch onto. He was definitely the community builder kind of guy, not the lone wolf. Anything, Stan? I have to say, I run a religious school. I'm not sure that, the children could be questioned on the entire Tanakh and Jewish history all the way down to Moses Mendelssohn. That's pretty impressive. Any thoughts about that?
Question.
Sure. Go ahead, Carol.
Did they get many takers coming from the West coming to Texas? Because I always thought it was a diversion of the Jews coming not to go to the
Right.
Lower East Side, but there were sent to Galveston instead in that window of opportunity. I wasn't aware of this.
Yeah, no, what you're talking about, and then Janice, I see you've got your hand up. He's really trying when this letter was written in 1878. He's trying to recruit people from San Francisco who were, coming maybe from Russia over east. Not everyone took the Atlantic crossing. Some took the Pacific crossing. So it's hard to, and often, and we'll learn about this in future classes, that Jewish newspapers was the main way that Jews communicated or got their information. So while this particular article, we have proof that ran in a San Francisco paper, chances are it ran on the East Coast as well. So he was really trying to give it a hard sell. And what you're talking about has to do with Jacob Schiff, who was trying to bring people from Russia and to help solve that, the challenge of Jews coming to the big cities, and to bring them through Galveston. And of course, that experiment only lasted 7 years. But this is trying to get other people who might have already settled in the United States into this coastal part of Texas.
My family, on my father's side came through Galveston in that
That's
way.
awesome. It's one of the coolest things that, how people settled here. So Janice, you have your hand up. Thank you.
Well, no, I was going to say something about Jacob Schiff. It was so overcrowded in New York, and the tenements and the Jews pouring in, and that's how we got here too. And they just took them down the coast in boats, and they also went to places where they had no means, like Arkansas, and they wanted them to farm, and Jews didn't know how to farm.
Not a lot of them did. That is true. In fact, that is actually when we get in about 3 weeks, we're gonna come back to this. So let's definitely put a pin in it and remember this, because we will continue to follow this conversation about how, as the railroad develops, how Jews utilize the railroad, and then sometimes we're sold a little bit of a bill of goods because they were, like you said, expected to be what the trades were that they were doing. And then when they get here, surprise, we want you to be ranchers and farmers, which was a new experience for many of them. Now, I did promise, and I'm being mindful of time, that we talked about anti-Semitism. And so often, at least growing up with my dad, I grew up on Westerns. And I remember hearing movies and stories about Judge Fauntleroy Bean. P.S. not Jewish, but definitely was a huge purveyor of anti-Semitism. So to kind of dispel the myth of this Wild West figure who made his way through Texas, he also was an anti-Semite. And in fact, Texas did suffer from anti-Semitism nearly as soon as we became a state in the 1800s. Now, keep in mind, miles of land stretched between cities, and in the Wild West of Pecos County, it made it challenging to create law and order. When it became known that justice of the peace was wanted for the area, saloon owner Roy Bean, not a stitch of legal experience, was quick to volunteer, and on August 2nd, 1882, he became the only legal authority in the area. He first operated his justice out of his tent saloon in Vinegaroon. Now, with the nearest court over 200 miles away at Fort Stockton, he quickly became the self-proclaimed, quote, only law west of the Pecos. So Judge Roy Bean's first set of legal justice, well, his first act was to shoot up, actually, there's an explicative in there, to shoot up the saloon shack of a Jewish competitor. So Judge Roy Bean used his legal authority to take out, he didn't kill, but he ran the Jewish competitor out of town. and turned that tent saloon into a part-time courtroom. So the way he gets out of this bad thing of running and threatening the Jewish barkeep or bar owner was to then turn his own saloon into a courtroom, pronounced his own innocence, and then calls himself the law west of the Pecos. What a hoot. Now, before we get, I do want to tell you a couple of other things about Jewish parts of note here. Is that other Jewish milestones. In the first graduating class of the University of Texas, any Longhorns in the group? Go ahead and put your hands up. Do I have any Longhorns? Okay, well, apparently I'm trying now. Let me get to this other screen. I don't think I do. That's interesting. Ah, Joe, I was going to say I knew that you were there. All right, so this little piece of trivia is just for you, Joe Reingold. In the first graduating class of the University of Texas, there were 2 Jews that graduated. Sid Samuels and Belle Doppelmayr graduated in 1881. And I mentioned earlier, Morris Lasker, he goes on to be elected to the state Senate in 1895. And by the 1890s, Jews had established themselves in additional communities. I think I had already mentioned Brenham and Corsicana and Gainesville, but they also, by the 1890s, were living in Palestine, Texarkana, Tyler, Port Arthur, Wichita Falls, Baytown, Corpus, Brownsville, New Braunfels, McAllen, Alice, Amarillo, Columbus, Wharton, Giddings, Navasota, Crockett, Lubbock, Longview, Jefferson, San Angelo, and Schulenburg. Now I should point out how many Jews are still there today. Not many, but during that time frame, again, putting that pin in and building the scene of how Texas utilized its time as both cattle and farming and the railroad, Jews followed that and lived in those communities to be able to develop the infrastructure and the economy and truly help support and grow the communities. Now, another person that has always been part of this class, looking at early history of Texas. When I was putting this course together originally, I was so curious to see more about Jewish women, and that really had an impact on our state. And I didn't have to search far before finding the incredible Olga Bernstein Kohlberg. Now, I have to say that her husband did incredible things too, and I'll talk about him a little bit. He was definitely a mensch. But it was Olga that was really had made a name for herself as an El Paso philanthropist and founder of the first public kindergarten in Texas. She used those Jewish values and midot to really develop and be passionate about providing education here in the state of Texas. She was born in Elberfeld, Westphalia, which was then part of Prussia, in 1864. She was the daughter of David and Emily Bernstein. She was educated at the Elberfeld Seminary and married Ernst Kohlberg. Again, he was a mensch in his own right in 1884. And when Kohlberg decides to take it, to come west and to leave Europe, she follows him. And now, why does he decide to leave Europe? Well, he was trying to escape the draft. Like so many Jews, he was put in conscription. And to do so, they end up leaving the area. And he founded the first cigar factory in the Southwest. Now, Mrs. Kohlberg, on her own, masters both English and Spanish, and she threw herself wholeheartedly into the affairs of her new community. In 1891, she helped organize a child culture study circle of local women to promote interest in the education of young children. The members bought equipment, they hired a teacher from St. Louis, and persuaded the El Paso Board of Education to establish the first free public kindergarten in Texas, which opened in 1893. the study circle reorganized and changed its name to Current Topics Club, which was the forerunner of the El Paso Women's Club, which was established in 1898. Olga served twice as president of that club in 1899 and 1900, and again, double duty in 1901 to 1902, and remained an honorary board member of the club for the rest of her life. She also served as vice president for the Texas Federation of Women's Clubs and served to the General Federation of Women's Clubs Assembly in California. In 1892, this is a story that really touched me. She had been on a platform taking a trip to the railroad depot when she saw the death of a sick man sitting there on the platform. She then forms the Ladies Benevolent Association, which opened the first hospital in El Paso. So not only is she forming the first school, or not the first school, but the first kindergarten, and a free one at that, she then sees the need for the first hospital and becomes, as the founder, she also becomes a board member of the Cloudcroft Baby Sanatorium in New Mexico, which opened in 1911. Now, I think you'll see, again, putting a pin, kind of setting the stage for future classes. One of the way that Jewish women make a mark on the West as they continue from Texas farther is the role that they play in developing health organizations and schools throughout the West. So many, whether it's in Utah and New Mexico, and especially in Denver at the time of the gold rush, these women like Olga really provide for what becomes this, otherwise it was just this Wild West area, and they gave it culture and society. Also, she didn't just stop with hospitals. She also helped to organize the El Paso Public Library. And in 1903, she became the second president of the library's board of directors. She served in that capacity until her death. She helped to organize the Mount Sinai Jewish Congregation in 1898 and contributed to the construction of Temple Mount Sinai 5 years later. She was also a member of the Jewish Welfare Association. When she died in 1935, she was survived by 3 sons and a daughter. The El Paso County Historical Society inducted her into their Hall of Fame in 1972. Now I have to share a little bit. I wish, and I didn't have this picture in the book, which I'll have to share with you next week. Ernst, her husband, was this Wild West looking guy. What I'm so fascinated by is the fact that he was, again, the first cigar maker. When there was a need, Jews had an ability to fill it. And if they needed cigars, Ernst was the one to make that happen. Now, we will, again, look the way the Sangers helped to provide. We'll also be talking in the future for next week about Julius Sheps and about, oh yeah, sorry, I see a hand up. Go for it. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I'm Carla Goodman Steinberg, and I'm very proud to say that Olga and Ernst are my great-grandparents that grew up.
That's incredible.
So they have really contributed a lot to El Paso and continue with that tradition. So,
I am so honored. Wow, that is fantastic. So I admit this was an earlier portrait that I had found of her. I do have some other pictures and other slides, and I really have to show you that, the picture that I have of Ernst. What a character. Do you have any family stories to share or anything that you know about their past?
I know a lot. He wrote letters home to his family in Prussia, and those letters were therefore translated by my grandfather, and they're in a book. And very interesting about his going over to Mexico and dancing with the señoritas and with the wild Indians in the West. And yeah, so a lot of history that is very, very interesting. But
It is fascinating. What incredible people to, and I can't stress enough. I mean, to be descended from this woman, like I said, Ernst is a character in himself, and he definitely was a mensch. One of the things that always struck me about him was that, you know, of course, politics shift so much. When I say the Republican Party in the 1890s was very different than Republican today, and the Democrats were very different then than they were today. But, you know, he himself was elected to the city council in 1893. And even though El Paso had always been traditionally very Democrat, he stuck by his Republican values and felt that, you know, he really wanted to preserve nature. And much like Teddy Roosevelt, he belonged to lots of clubs, and a lot of that had to do with supporting the businesses and the community. I mean, he, again, fascinating family. Truly what I think. There was also some stories about a compulsive gambler. Do you know that one? He actually leased part of the, so he owned lots of property, including the St. Regis Hotel, which actually brought President Taft to El Paso during the time. And he had leased the this area to, or the St. Charles Hotel, to John Leach, who fell way behind on his rent. Well, Kohlberg turned the matter over to his attorney, but on June 17th of 1910, Leach confronted Kohlberg and demanded that he withdrew his suit. Well, Kohlberg refused, whereupon Leach drew a revolver and killed him. So that's actually how Kohlberg died, was that he had gotten into a fight with someone who owed him money. And Kohlberg tried his best to like work with him and do what he could. But this horrible compulsive gambler was sentenced to life imprisonment at Huntsville. Unfortunately, he was pardoned by Governor Ferguson. But it was, by the way, if you've ever written the book, The Wonderful Country, Kohlberg was used as the prototype for the character Ludwig Sterner. So another little piece of trivia there. Well, I'm so glad that you spoke up. That was awesome. I like I said, I've used this in multiple classes, and I think you're one of the first people that I've ever had say, but I'm the great granddaughter of this person. So that's exciting. Well, next week, again, we're going to be, I'm sure there's, I'm going the wrong direction. I'm hoping that you will find, for those of us who have lived or have roots to Dallas, next week, we're going to be doing a little multimedia, watching a little bit of film, learning more. This is actually, I know several of you belong to Temple Emmanuel. This is Temple Emmanuel's original building. I'm going to be using some of the information I'm borrowing from Rose Bitterman's book, They Came to Stay. I've got all sorts of, like I said, multimedia pieces. So next week should be really fun. So are there any questions? I want to open it up for questions or comments, or let me stop sharing. There we go. Any thoughts?
Class. Great class. Very
Yay!
Fantastic, Barry.
Well, I'm just excited. The dog didn't bark once. It's a miracle. And awesome. Yes, David, there is a recording of the class today. So if you've missed it, I know that Rochelle and Adina can share it.
Yes, great class, Barry.
Good. Well, good. Joe, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that I've done a lot of extensive research on especially small towns in Texas through the Dallas Jewish Historical Society. But the interesting thing is a lot of people that I've spoken to whose families settled in these tiny towns where there was hardly any, if any, other Jewish families. One of the reasons that they stayed there was if they could get to a synagogue or a Sunday school or Hebrew school or something within like an hour or so, because a lot of them tried very, very hard to maintain their Jewish roots. keeping kosher might have been a problem and other things might have been a problem, but they truly believed in at least driving their kids to the closest Sunday school, which might have been an hour away. And I give all of them credit for doing that, because it must have been extremely hard in those days, any day in time,
Absolutely.
to get to the closest synagogue and make sure your child at least and you yourself has an education.
Absolutely. And, and to that point, you'll see as people are moving, we're really, as we're on our historical timeline with the Kohlbergs, we're already to the 1900s. So as we start seeing life from, the 1800s to that 19th century was so challenging. Then we start to see the lone wolves merging into the community members. And then once they got there, even like our family, settled outside of Waco in Marlin, felt connected, tried to run their business, and stayed that way even when there were no Jews left. Janice, I see you have your hand up too.
Well, my grandfather, Abraham Isidore Deitch, opened a little store after being a peddler all over the South with his brother, Israel Deitch. And they were from Russia, not Deutsch, not Germany, but when they immigrated, the man must have said, the agent must have said Deutsch. So it became Deitch. But he opened a store called Deitch's in Bay City, Texas. Eventually his son-in-law took it over. But the reason the son-in-law stayed there was so he could drive to Houston every Sunday morning to take his children to Sunday school. And when there was no rabbi, too few Jews, but they did have a minyan.
Right.
And every Friday night, the women would bake and sit in the back. The men would stand around the table and pray, and the children would run around the outside screaming and yelling.
Not a bad way to grow up, right?
I lived there for a while with my aunt and uncle, and that's what they did. And really small town. The streets were paved with shells, like oyster shells. Wow. I remember I lived there for a while with that family, and I walked to school. Some of the kids walked barefooted, went to school barefoot, didn't matter.
Totally different life. But wow, that's a great.
Not like growing up in New York.
Right. Right. And so often with those name changes, it might have been, I'm just throwing this out there. It could have been something like Deutsch Kievsky, but then as they moved, it was easier to spell, easier to say. It might have sounded like something, and so, Deutsch it became. So
when you were there, was there a store named Rosenzweig's? Because I have relatives from Bay City as well, merchants. And the story there, my grandfather, they had 8 children, and he set up each child, or if it was a daughter, the son-in-law, in another little town in Texas with a store. Alice, Bay City, Baytown, Kingsville.
And that's, so there's a connection to Bayside. So Rosenzweig and Deitch were both in Bayside, right?
Bay City.
Bay City, got it.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. And that's a similar thing to our family. We had the Handelmans had stores in all throughout. They had a big store in New Orleans where the building still is there today, but then had places, although they called it the Magnificent in Waco or in Marlin, but then they had stores in all over the South. So it's incredible. That was a very similar to both families, where they were peddlers first, and then once they got established, became part of their communities, and once their kids could get old enough to do it. And here comes the puppy right on cue. Any other thoughts or questions before we wrap up today? Excellent. Well, I look forward to seeing you again next week.
Thank you.
All righty. Be well, everybody.
Everyone.
Well, stay safe.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Barry.